Oh, welcome to this explainer. Let's jump right in and uncover exactly why the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion actually happened. We often think of the founding of the United States as this incredibly seamless transition from the Revolutionary War straight into a stable democracy. But the reality was far more volatile. Today, we're going to look at a moment when the young nation literally almost tore itself apart. We're starting our story right in the thick of it, at the Battle of Bower Hill. It's July 1794, and an armed mob of American citizens is actively attacking and eventually burning down the plantation home of a federal tax inspector. Now, this isn't a protest against a foreign king. This is a violent insurrection against the laws of their own newly established country. And this explosive climax begs a pretty massive question. How on earth did the newly formed United States reach the absolute brink of civil war just 5 years after ratifying the Constitution? What could possibly drive veterans of the Revolutionary War to take up arms against the very government they just fought to create? To answer that, we're going to peel back this onion layer by layer. We'll look at the Battle of Bower Hill, Hamilton's whiskey tax, frontier economics and geography, the ideological divide, and finally, Washington's federal response. All right, let's get into Section 1, the Battle of Bower Hill. So it's July 1794. Retired General John Neville is serving as the regional tax inspector, and he finds himself surrounded by armed men from the local Mingo Creek militia. They were convinced a federal marshal was inside his home serving writs to delinquent distillers. On July 16th, shots ring out, and a protester named Oliver Miller Jr. is mortally wounded. Well, the very next day, enraged by the bloodshed, an astounding 400 to 800 armed men return for retribution. Despite getting reinforcements from a nearby federal arsenal, Neville's forces were completely routed, and his entire plantation was burned right down to the stone foundations. But, this violence didn't just pop up out of nowhere in 1794. Back in 1791, a tax collector named Robert Johnson was actually tarred and feathered. So by the time we hit Bower Hill, we are seeing coordinated military-style attacks. Following the destruction of Neville's home, a local prosecuting attorney named David Bradford managed to gather a staggering 7,000 followers at Braddock's Field near Pittsburgh. And get this, they were actively discussing declaring independence from the United States entirely. Let's peel back layer 2, Section 2, Hamilton's whiskey tax. Back in 1791, Congress passed an excise tax that was heavily championed by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. This was incredibly significant because it was the very first internal tax levied by the new federal government. The primary goal here was just to raise the necessary revenue to pay off the massive debts the federal government had assumed from the states after the Revolutionary War. Hamilton absolutely needed a steady national revenue stream to stabilize the young nation's credit. He went with distilled spirits because, in his eyes, liquor was a luxury item. He reasoned that an excise on a luxury wouldn't place an undue burden on the general population. Furthermore, he confidently, and as we'll see, spectacularly incorrectly, assumed that the average citizen wouldn't aggressively resist it. He figured they'd simply drink less peacefully if they didn't want to pay the tax. Which brings us to Section 3, Frontier Economics and Geography. See, Hamilton's assumption was completely disconnected from the harsh realities of the frontier. The tax was highly regressive. Large eastern distillers could pay a flat fee that broke down to about 6 cents per gallon, but the small distillers out west, the frontier farmers, they were charged 9 cents per gallon. And crucially, this tax had to be paid in scarce cash, specie like gold or silver coin, which was virtually non-existent on the frontier. For these Western farmers, whiskey was definitely not a luxury. It was a literal lifeline. Grain is incredibly bulky. It actually cost more to transport it over the treacherous Appalachian mountain roads than the grain itself was even worth. But if you distill that grain into whiskey, a single horse could carry the equivalent of 20 bushels of rye in just 2 kegs. Because actual cash was so rare, whiskey literally served as their currency. People were paid their wages in it, landlords took it for rent, so taxing whiskey was effectively taxing a poor farmer's only means of survival. And beyond the tax itself, there was this massive geographic injustice built right into how the law was enforced. If a frontier farmer was accused of evading this crippling tax, they were forced to travel 300 miles over mountains to Philadelphia just to stand trial in a federal court. I mean, imagine having to trek 300 miles over rugged terrain just to fight a traffic ticket. It was a financially ruining journey designed to strip them of their ability to have their cases heard locally.
Let's move right along to Section 4, the ideological divide.
This whole situation was about way more than just a dispute over pennies and gallons. It was really a battle over the soul of the Republic. Looking at it neutrally, we have two very different camps. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, viewed the tax as good for public health and essential for debt reduction. Economically, they wanted industry consolidation, and politically, they were terrified of French Revolution-style anarchy spreading in America. On the flip side, the frontier farmers viewed the tax as a highly regressive, aristocratical policy that essentially stole from the poor to pay wealthy debt holders. Their economic goal was progressive taxation and wealth parity to sustain a true republic. Politically, they feared they had just traded British tyranny for federal tyranny, raising that familiar old cry of taxation without representation. Both sides genuinely believed the very survival of the American experiment was on the line.
And for some folks, the whiskey tax was just a convenient excuse to burn the whole system down. A rebel was recorded at the time by writer Hugh Henry Breckinridge, declaring that not only must the excise law go down, but high offices and salaries must be eliminated entirely. These radicals wanted to abolish judges, tear down the establishment, and just completely dismantle the apparatus of the new state. So this pressure cooker took years to actually explode. The tax passed in spring 1791, and almost immediately peaceful protests and petitions began. But for years, the Westerners felt completely ignored. Finally, in June 1794, the federal government issued subpoenas for dozens of delinquent distillers to appear in that federal court in Philadelphia. That sudden legal escalation, that was the final spark that ignited the explosive violence at Bower Hill just weeks later. And that leads us to our final layer today, Section 5, Washington's federal response. Facing its very first existential crisis, the young government held its breath. President George Washington responded with overwhelming, unmistakable force. He summoned 12,500 militiamen from 4 different states. To put that staggering number into perspective, that was an army roughly the exact same size as the one that had just fought the British for independence. And by riding out to review and command these troops, Washington became the only sitting president in American history to ever lead an army in the field. Before marching, Washington issued a proclamation in August 1794, officially ordering the rebels to disperse. The public reaction to this was really fascinating. Before this moment, the national press had been deeply divided, with plenty of newspapers fiercely criticizing the tax. But once Washington issued his proclamation, the press universally united against the rebels. The widespread public fear of secession and a descent into civil war entirely overrode any sympathy they had for the farmers' economic plight. So faced with universal public condemnation and a massive federal army marching west, the organized insurgency simply dissolved peacefully without a major pitched battle. Ultimately, while the rebellion was physically suppressed and the federal government proved it could, in fact, enforce its laws, the underlying bitterness certainly did not go away. The massive ideological disputes we've unpacked today over taxation, states' rights, and the true power of the federal government solidified and effectively gave birth to America's first party system, pitting Hamilton's Federalists directly against Jefferson and Madison's Democratic Republicans for decades to come. Which leaves us with this final, rather profound thought to ponder from today's explainer. The Washington administration successfully proved that a democratic republic could raise an army from its own citizens to enforce its laws and maintain order. But when we look at the deeply regressive nature of that tax and the genuine desperation of those frontier farmers, we really have to ask, where exactly is the line between a justified protest against an unfair system and a dangerous rebellion that threatens the entire nation? It's a fundamental question Americans have been trying to answer ever since. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the headlines.